All right, what's going on, everybody? Today we have an extremely special guest. He's somebody I've been wanting to interview for a very long time. He's the owner of arguably the largest cigar boutique brand in the world. Goes by the name of Jon Huber. John, thank you so much for doing this.
Yes, my pleasure, man. I don't know if we're the largest by any stretch of the imagination, but I'll take the
Or
compliment,
like
man.
as a boutique brand,
Yeah,
would you
yeah,
consider yourself up there?
I think we're in the conversation, but in terms of, large and boutique are kind of an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms, I think, a little bit. But I'm happy
Yeah.
with where we're at. I don't look
Absolutely. Yeah.
absolutely.
So just give the people in the Canadian market and our customers just a background of your history with cigars. I know you started with CAO, and then
hmm
you made that transition to form your own company, but that was back in 1996. And can you give us like shed some more light onto like what got you into it and what got you to where you are now?
Yeah, man. So in '96, I just kind of fell into it more or less. I fell in love with cigars. I just happened to be in a cigar store looking to buy a gift for my father. I was flying back to California, and I said, "Oh, cigars, that'd be kind of cool." And as soon as I walked into the humidor at that retail store, I was like, the smell of the cedar and the tobacco, and it's just like a light bulb moment went off. I'm like, this is what I want to do. And I'll give you the Reader's Digest condensed version, but I basically started sending letters to everybody I could find in Cigar Aficionado magazine. Got rejected by everybody, and then my last chance was with a company called CAO, and I noticed that they were in Nashville, and I had just moved to Nashville. And so 4 months later, I got a call from the owner, rest in peace, John Huber, and he gave me a shot. And from there, I worked my way up the food chain, so to speak. I started off as a shipping manager, and then got promoted to promotions and public relations and chief marketing officer, then lifestyle director. And we went all the way from '96 to 2010, and then in 2010, that's when CAO was brought into Virginia to go under General Cigars, and I did not want to go. So
Right on. Yeah.
yeah, so we started, Mike Conder and I, who used to be my boss in the marketing department at CAO. He and I started Crowned Heads in February of 2011. So that's where we're
Awesome.
at. Yeah.
Awesome stuff. Yeah. So, in the previous interviews I've watched, you often refer to your time at CAO as your undergraduate studies.
Yes.
At what point would you consider yourself a graduate during your time and eventually formed your own company at Crown? Like, what was the trigger point where you're like, okay, now I think I'm at the point where I can form my own company?
I mean, it is one of those things like be careful what you wish for, you might get it, because up until then, like CIO was just some of the most fun I've ever had in my life. I mean, we had such a blast, at CIO. It was a whole different thing. But then when you become the person responsible for creating everything
Yep.
to support, not only yourself and your family, but others and other families, it becomes a lot more of a pressure thing. And I consider myself still getting my graduate degree. I mean, I'm still
Awesome.
learning every day. I'm still, and that's what makes it fun and interesting for me is to be able to continually, go to work, so to speak, and keep learning and keep growing. So
Right on.
I'm still learning.
And I know you've answered this question in the past, John, but just for our Canadian viewers, what was the inspiration or what kind of triggered the name Crowned Heads?
Well, so my last day at CAO was December 17th, 2010. And then 4 days later, Mike and I started having meetings, kind of defining the philosophy of what the new company would be. And then one of my first tasks was coming up with a name for this company. And so I took the better part of about 3 weeks to kind of jot down names, and I would send them to Mike, and Mike would like some, and I wouldn't, and vice versa. And then we would agree on one name, and then the attorneys would be like, you can't use this name. So like, okay. So one day I'm watching The Wizard of Oz, which is like a fascinating movie to me, and there's one scene in The Wizard of Oz, I think the movie's from 1939 or something, and before it goes to full color, Dorothy goes to see Professor Marvel, and on the side of his caravan it says "Crowned Heads of Europe, Past, Present, Future." And I just screenshot it, and I said, "What about crowned heads?" And Mike's like, "Yeah, I like that." And I'm like, "I do too." And so that's the real story behind Crowned Heads. It's just I nicked it off of the Wizard of Oz, but the idea, obviously, it's not that simple. But the idea was that we would create something that begged people to ask the question, "What is Crowned Heads?" I didn't want it to be like Conder Huber or Huber Conder Cigars. I wanted it
Yeah,
to be
yeah,
something that had, some bandwidth where I could create,
right
and that's
on.
why we created Crown Heads.
Right on. Yeah. So I realized another thing when you talk about the innovation behind your brand, like your line of cigars are not named like Crown Heads this, Crown Heads that, like the way many other brands go about it. And
Yeah,
I know in the past I've heard you mention that your vision for the company is to marry tradition with innovation. And I think
correct.
you kind of exemplify that with the lines of cigars that you're putting out there and the names behind it.
Thank you.
Can you elaborate more on what you mean by that phrase, marry tradition with innovation?
Well, I go back to a quote that one of my best friends in the business, Pete Johnson, said. He's like, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel because the Cubans invented the wheel, and you have to pay respect and homage to that tradition, but you try to put your fingerprints on it in some way, shape, or form. So
Right.
that's what I mean. It's like a lot of our stuff is heavily influenced by traditional, old school Cuban or even non-Cuban cigars, and then we try to put our spin on it in some way, shape, or form. But going back to what you just said about crowned heads, it was important that I didn't want to get into that box where it had to be crowned heads this, crowned heads that. I wanted to create the band crowned heads and then have the creative latitude to create albums by the band that they all sounded differently from each other. So
Yeah.
that's why I didn't want to do like crown heads Maduro, crown heads natural, it's like,
Right on.
you know what I mean? It's like, so I wanted to have that freedom to create, and that's what we've done to this point.
Absolutely. And for those who aren't aware, I know you work with a lot of you call them the OG godfathers of the
Oh,
industry. Ernesto Perez Carrillo, we love his
yes.
cigars, and he definitely plays a big role. But how big of a role in terms of the quality of cigars that you put out there? Like, how much of an influence is he during that process?
Oh, huge, huge influence. I mean, it all comes down to the tobaccos first and foremost, having access to the right tobaccos, having access to adequate inventory of those tobaccos. So we're very fortunate that we get to work with the people that we work with, and beyond Ernie, working with the Garcia family at my father's cigars. We've worked with Drew Estate. We're currently working with Naxa, with
Wow.
an old friend of ours, Gustavo Jura, and
Wow.
Raul Disla. And these guys are just the best of the best. So, I mean, it makes my job, I don't want to say easy, but it makes it easier because then all I have to do is really kind of validate what they're already doing, which is great work.
Exactly, yeah. And your brand is kind of like an extension of that. And
Mm.
back on the topic of innovation, you've dedicated cigars like Jericho Hill to music legends like Johnny Cash, I believe it
Yeah,
was. Correct me if I'm wrong,
correct. No, you're
but
right.
it was Johnny Cash.
Yes.
So like, does music play a role in your creative process when you go about the formation of these blends?
Somewhat. It just varies from project to project, but obviously, music has a huge influence on my creative output.
Yep.
But it's not just music; it can be anything from music to film to art to skate and surf culture. All these things that kind of speak to me just kind of eventually find their way into uh, projects, so whether it be cigars, apparel, what have you. So, but music is definitely a key component for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then, do you have particularly favorite tobaccos you enjoy working with? The ones that are most accessible? Like I know, Perez Carrillo helps a lot with that part of the business in terms of gaining access to that. What are some of your favorite tobaccos that you'd enjoy working with?
Well, starting out, like if you're talking about rappers, like I've always been a big fan of Habano from Ecuador, whether it be Oscuro, Rosado, what have you. But um, Ernie has been able to educate me in terms of opening my perspective to other things like Sumatra. I mean, I always call him the Sultan of Sumatra because he was always pushing me to work with Sumatra in terms of rapper. And I was always very
Mm,
reluctant. I wasn't a fan until we did Headley Grange back in 2012, I believe it was
yeah,
initially. And then yeah. And now I work a great deal with Sumatra as well. And I like working with Corojo. We've
yeah,
been working with the Garcias on some Corojo stuff. And as far as fillers go, I love Nicaraguan tobacco the most, to be
yeah.
honest with you. But I'm learning now, even at this late phase of my career, that putting a little bit of Dominican in there really kind of brightens up a good Nicaraguan cigar too.
Yeah, absolutely. And then,
Mm.
so I guess the next question that I have for you, and this is kind of a personal question because I'm still trying to learn the distinction between different kinds of variations of these tobacco seeds and what makes them different. And I know the Ecuadorian Sumatra, it's just a Sumatran seed planted in Ecuador.
Hmm.
It's far different than the Sumatra island in Indonesia, right? When you get the tobacco directly from there,
Correct.
is that the Sumatra that Ernesto Perez is working with when he uses your blends? Is like which variation of the two
He uses
does
the
he enjoy?
Ecuadorian Sumatra.
The Ecuadorian
Definitely.
Sumatra. I've
Yeah.
noticed a lot of the other award-winning blends, they use the Ecuadorian Sumatra. It seems to have
Mm.
more of a distinct flavor profile that consumers enjoy more often.
Yeah, it's really evolved. I mean, when I first started Crown Heads, it was everything was Habano, and it's I still use Habano. Like in fact, this cigar is Habano Oscuro. But yeah, we've been branching out into some Sumatra. We've also used like Connecticut Ecuador. We've used Connecticut Habano. I mean, I've pretty much run the gamut over the last decade of different, varietals. There's just so much out there, and it just really varies from, season to season, harvest to harvest. Like broadleaf was hot for a minute,
Right.
and then we ran into a broadleaf shortage, which really impacted a lot of our stuff. And now we're starting to get back up to speed with broadleaf again. So, um, but broadleaf isn't one of my personal favorites. It just seems to be like one of the most popular domestic varietals. I'll say that. People tend,
Right.
especially in the United States, I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, people tend to smoke with their eyes and they gravitate towards what's darker and they think that has more flavor to it. So
Right.
broadleaf tends to be a little bit darker and more sturdy.
I understand there's some level of variation between the Pennsylvania broadleaf and
Yeah.
Connecticut broadleaf, right?
Hmm.
I think the as far as I was told, a good friend of mine said the Connecticut broadleaf is a little bit sweeter than the Pennsylvania broadleaf. Is that
It is
one of
true,
yeah?
true Connecticut broadleaf.
A
Yeah.
true from the River Valley.
The Pennsylvania broadleaf is actually like a hybrid. It's not a true broadleaf. It's called like PS something something. Willie Herrera taught me this, and it's not as legit broadleaf as Connecticut. And now there's some talk that they're growing broadleaf in Kentucky that's true broadleaf, and it's supposed to be very good. So I have yet to see anything come out with that, but I heard it smokes really nicely too. So
I'm excited for that actually. I know
yeah.
Kentucky is known for their fire cured tobaccos,
Hmm.
right? Drew Estate kind of I think popularized that. Correct me if I'm
Yeah.
wrong.
Drew does a lot of innovative things, man. I'm
Innovative
I'm a
things,
big
yeah.
fan. Absolutely.
Yeah, likewise. So the next question is actually from one of our viewers. He watches our episodes, and he was excited when I told him John's coming on. He wants to know. He speaks Spanish, right? So mil
Hmm.
dias to him translates to 1,000 days,
That's correct.
and I did some reading on it, and I understand that it took 1,000 days for the whole creation of the blend, right?
That's the story
Is that like
behind
the
it.
general theme behind it? Is there
Correct.
anything beyond that that you can elaborate on for us?
Well, so this goes back to 2017, and I was at a trade show, and I was introduced to Horacio Pichardo, and I didn't know who Horacio was, but he handed me some samples of cigars, and he didn't speak very much English, and my Spanish is I can get by. I can understand more than I can speak.
Yeah,
So I took the samples, and I was like really impressed with these cigars, and so we started. I thought it was a little aggressive initially, and so I started to send feedback to their factory and saying, can we round this out? Can we play with this a little bit? So we kind of just off and on worked on that until we got to the final blend, which I got a hold of in January of 2020. And I was like, oh, this is really special. I thought this was really an exceptional blend.
right.
So, then you got to come up with like, what's the purpose? What's the reason? What's the story? So I was like, man, this took us off and on like 3 years to really come up with it. And that roughly is 1,000 days. So that's how I
Yeah.
came up with the story of Mil Diaz. But it's like, I don't want people to think that like for 1,000 days, I tried like,
Every
sample
single
after sample.
day, yeah, I
Yeah, no, no,
understand.
no, no, no. This was like, hit the pause button, come back to it in a month, get some more samples, that kind of thing. So, but
Okay, yeah.
it's done very well for us. That's a really good blend.
Oh, for us too. It's I think one of the best sellers in our catalog for the crowned heads category. But
Awesome.
the best seller and the one that we always try to keep in stock, no matter what season of the year it is the La Carême. I'm sure you're well aware of the
Ah, yes.
popularity behind it. It has the
Yes.
Connecticut broadleaf wrapper and
Correct.
I believe Sumatra binder, or that may be La
Correct.
Pâtissier, or
No, no, no.
that's the La Carême.
Le Carême, that's made it Tobacco de la Alianza by Ernesto Perez Carrillo. Connecticut broadleaf, Sumatra binder, Nicaraguan and Dominican in the filler. And yeah, we
Perfect.
released that. I want to say 2015. Um,
2015. Yeah.
yeah, and that's when that came out, and it just stuck. It's been a real winner for us, and we had a little bit of an outage because of the broadleaf shortage.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
that's kind of I realized, the distributors were explaining to us that there's not the most accessible cigar
hmm
for the Canadian
hmm
market, and I know there is another comparable cigars for like my personal opinion, La Pâtissier, right? Did I pronounce
Yes,
that correctly?
you did. You did a great
Right
job.
on. And what is the distinction between the two? I know they both use the Connecticut broadleaf wrappers. Correct me
Right.
if I'm wrong.
They do. They
They
do.
do, yes, and they kind of have a similar theme. Le Carême was popularized by a French chef in the 1800s, as far as I'm aware.
Did your
And
research. Marie
yeah,
Antoine Carême. Yeah,
yeah, well, it's a great cigar. Yeah,
he's credited with this French chef that you referred to with coming up with the chocolate souffle
right on.
and as a dessert. So when we were working on Carême with Ernie, one day he told me, he goes, man, he goes, have you smoked this sample? And I was like, yeah, it's fantastic. I said, man, it smokes like a chocolate souffle. And that just stuck
Wow,
with me. So that I did a
very
little
true though.
research. Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's how we came up with the brand Carême. And then Patissier was really just started off as a PCA exclusive the year before last, and it was just an offshoot of Carême. And Patissier just means like pastry chef. And so we started doing Patissier with Radio Pichardo, also using Connecticut broadleaf. And then it did so well as the exclusive for PCA that we said, let's just make this its own brand. So it's got a slightly different wrapper binder filler combination, but and then to make things even more confusing, we shifted production of Patissier within the last few months from Pichardo to Noxa. So Noxa will be making it, and they're doing a fantastic job with that, and they have access to the best broadleaf. So I'm very excited for the future of the Patissier.
And do you think we can expect that in the Canadian market soon? I've had it before as a gift. Of course, I've smoked both of them. It's just me being I consider myself like a passionate cigar enthusiast beyond like the business level of being
Yeah,
involved on a retailer and
I
whatnot.
the short answer to that is Brigham. It depends
Right.
if they'll bring it in. That's not something I'm actively involved with. Our national sales manager Miguel Shodell works with all of our international distributors, so I guess that comes down to their conversations. But I would hope so. It's a great cigar.
Yeah, but phenomenal cigar. Okay, so I want to transition. We launched a website recently, and one of the many sampler packs I added was the Crowned Heads sampler pack. So for many people who haven't tried the Crowned Heads cigar line, I curated a sampler from the blends that we have available. I kind of wanted to give a variety of different strength levels, ones that I've personally enjoyed, and then
Okay.
we, like many other business models, we discount the whole sampler pack if anyone wants to try a variety. I want to get your thoughts on the lineup that I have selected. I have I know there's one called the Juan Brown, correct?
Jack
Juan
Brown.
Jack Brown, and then the one is the OBS,
OBS is the 4 3/4 by 52 Jericho Hill.
Jericho Hill.
Yeah.
Okay, and the other two, La Imperiosa and La Caram.
Yes.
Right on.
Fantastic. La
Yeah.
Imperiosa, actually, it's made at my father's cigars in Esteli,
Oh, I had no
Nicaragua.
idea.
Yeah. So the story behind La Imperiosa is when we did our very first Las Calaveras limited edition in 2014 with my father, it took off like crazy. I mean, it just everybody wanted more and more of that. So I took that blend and repurposed it into a regular production line called La Imperiosa, which means the imperative, that which is necessary. It's an old Cuban brand that we actually were able to register. And so it uses the same combination of tobaccos as the 2014 Calaveras. But La Imperiosa is excellent, man. I just had, was it Thursday morning? I started my day with the Corona Gorda in that line, which is 5 3/4 by 46. Fantastic cigar. Just
Phenomenal. Yeah.
fantastic. Yeah.
Right on. And what's the history behind La Imperiosa? Dates back to the 1920s, when I was
Yeah.
doing my research on it.
Yeah,
Uh,
in fact, not to
how
interrupt you,
crazy
but
is that? Yeah.
we have the original Vista from 19, probably the tens or twenties, 1910s to 1920s. It was gifted to us by Vrydog, which they're very famous band and label makers out of Holland, and they initially were doing the packaging for us on La Imperiosa back in 2015.
Wow.
And so yeah, it hangs in my office. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So you mentioned My Father's, the factory behind that particular blend.
Hmm.
Phenomenal. Yeah, huge fan of their cigars as well.
Yes.
And then another question I had. So I looked at your most recent IG post, and you're talking about what you have planned in 2023,
Yeah.
and how much bigger of a year you can expect from 2022. Is there anything in the works that you can talk about, or do you want to just wait until the time comes by? Like any new blends, new projects, new creations?
I mean, we've been pretty active this year. I mean, I can't even add up all the new stuff we've dropped this year, but most recently, we just did the Lancero and Four Kicks Capa Especial. We released
Yeah, I
that.
saw that. I saw that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's shipping now. And then Azul y Oro, which is what I'm smoking, that just landed Friday, so we're shipping that this week as well. That's our first LE from Naxa. And of course, they're doing Le Patissier, which we will get that shipment in at the end of the month. So all of the product going forward will be from Naxa on Le Patissier. I'm working on the first thing we'll have coming out in 23 will be a La Carême offshoot. And
Wow.
yeah, it's I'm pretty excited about it. I'm shooting for February, March, but it's called pastelitos, which is a little Cuban dessert. And so I wanted to make a small format carême that for the winter months, so people have a short smoke. So it's a
Exactly.
little
Yeah,
short, fat La
absolutely.
Carême in a round format, and that'll be
Wow.
a limited edition. So we're working on that with Ernie. I've been working with Ernie on a brand new regular production brand that we thought we could get ready for the first quarter of next year, but it's looking more and more like it'll be the summer release. But I'm excited about that. We're still playing with the blends. Ernie's a great guy, but he's like, if it's not right, he's like, okay, we're starting all over. So throw those away. I'm going to send you more samples. So
Yeah.
yeah, we got a lot of new stuff, and it'll be fun because I'll be able to work with Naxa more, and they've got a great supply of tobaccos, and they're just good people, and I'm very excited for
Yeah.
23.
For those who are unaware, you keep mentioning the factory, I believe Naxam, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I believe, like for me, I don't think they're as globally recognized as Perez Carrillo and My Father and whatnot. Can you give us
Correct.
some more background as to what this factory is and how are they like involved with the creation process?
So Naxa, Nicaraguan American Cigars SA, they're out of Esteli. They're now run by a good friend of ours, Gustavo Cura. And so Gus, I call him Gus, but Gustavo basically back in 2011 was the gentleman that really kind of chaperoned Mike and I in Central America when we were looking for factories to produce what would become Crowned Heads. Um, and so he, like every warehouse we went to, every tobacco facility, every processing plant, every manufacturer, Gus made the introduction. At that time, Naxa was run by a guy named Omar Ortiz. And
Yes,
yeah,
familiar.
so we visited that factory. It really wasn't a good fit for us. And then earlier this year, I was talking to Willie Herrera, and I was telling him about some things that were going on behind the scenes. And he's like, man, he goes, why don't you look into Naxa? And I'm like, Naxa, isn't that Omar? And he's like, no. Gustavo's running that. I'm like, really? And then a small world story. So the gentleman that's in charge of blending down there, Old Isla, is
Yeah.
the brother to Esteban. And Esteban used to work at STG, which used to make CAO cigars. So we knew Esteban. So his brother Raul is the guy at Naxa. So it's all kind of a small world thing. So I called Gus earlier in the year and I said, hey, I'm looking to move some production, create some new things. And he's like, we would love to do stuff with you guys because we want to get more boutiques in our house. And so to this point, he's been working with Steve Saka
Wow.
at Dunbarton Tobacco and Trust. And I think Steve has Mi Querida that comes out of there, the Tricky Traca, some really great cigars. So the Naxa that I knew in 2011 is a complete different animal than what they are in 2022. So that's a little bit of the story with Naxa, and they've been fantastic to work with to this point. They've been really just on point. I mean, even it's a small story, but we were working on a cigar, which would become Azul y Oro, and they'd sent me some samples, and I was like, I'm not 100%. I said, do you have access to this other tobacco? I'm looking for something with some Esteli Ligero, a little bit more body, a little more structure.
Yes,
And so
yes.
I had one conference call before I flew to Vegas, and I told them the direction I was going. And then I get to Vegas, and 2 days later, Raul's there with two bundles of cigars. He said, "These are for you," and he had reblended them based on my direction and gave them to me. I'm like, "Wow, amazing!" So, and it was that easy. So they've been wonderful to work with and very timely, very efficient. So I'm looking to do more and more stuff with them in 23 for sure.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's 2023. Are there speaking of like in collaborations and whatnot? I know Mike from CAO recently, or sorry, it was Tim. I believe Tim is so
Tim
used to
Osner,
be
yes.
yeah Tim. Confused the names. Sorry, but
Hmm.
yeah, he recently reunited with you at Crowned Heads. Was it earlier in
Hmm.
2022?
Yeah, it was very early in 2022. Actually,
Yeah,
at the end of 21, Mike Condor called me and said, "Hey, I got some news." And so, "What's that?" And he's like, "Tim wants to come back in the business." I'm like,
yeah,
"Great, you know." But I said I don't want to get the trick of the trade there was like I didn't want to get in his lane because I didn't want what he does to look like another Crown Heads retread. I wanted him to have his own brand identity, which to his credit, he went off and did. And he
absolutely.
created Oscar Family Cigars, which is we distribute it from Crown Heads, but it is part of Crown Heads. It's an extension of Crown Heads for sure. And he came out at the trade show with his first line called Bosphorus, which initially was being made again at Pichardo, but now has been relocated to Tabacalera La Alianza with Ernesto, and they made just a couple of tweaks to it, and it's a total level up. It's fantastic, and he's already working on his second brand, which we hope to get out for February, also being made at La Alianza as well.
That's awesome. Yeah, because
Yeah.
I understood he was like kind of a sentimental like connection when you started first with CAO. I think his father was he the owner of the company CAO when you first
Yes.
started? You sent him the letter the old
I
school
sent
way,
yeah. So
trying to get the job. Yeah.
correct. Jono is Tim's dad.
Okay,
Um,
yeah,
and Jono passed in 2018. But Jono was definitely a huge influence on not only my career but my life. Just he was such a great man, spiritual. He's like a father figure to all of us. And I'd sent Jono a letter going back to 1996, whatever, and and I hadn't heard anything from Jono, and I just kind of like wrote it off like whatever. But Tim happened to be in the office one day, and he said, "Hey." He saw my letter. He says, "Dad, why don't you give this guy a call? He sounds like he really wants to be in the business. You know, he might be good." And so, thankfully, to Tim's directive, John calls me, and the rest is history. But Tim and I have been good friends for since '96.
yeah.
And we went through the whole CAO thing all together. And once CAO left, Tim went off and did Oz Arts, and which is a nonprofit uh, arts center here in Nashville. And then I think he just wanted to get back in. He missed the interaction with people and the creative process, and so it's been great. So we launched his brand in July, and we've already surpassed our goal in terms of sales for that brand. And so he's been out literally like every week promoting that brand and done a great job. And it's wonderful to have him back in the fold, so to speak.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
phenomenal stuff. A great history. You got the whole 9 yards when it comes to the history of cigar, and like a lot of these cigar enthusiasts, they come off comparable backgrounds that you do yourself. Who is the inspirational factor behind the hats that you create? Because I noticed you're such a hats guy,
I am,
and
dude. I
every
am.
video I see you got a comparable hat, but I know like the design's always different. So how does that? Where
Yeah.
does that come about?
That's just been something I design all of them.
Yeah,
So it's been just a passion of mine since I was a little boy. I've always loved hats. So I started collecting hats when I was, God, I might have been like 7, 8 years old. And and it's always, even at CAO, it was always kind of a creative thing where I could, do something else. And so I've always designed the hats. And so then with Crown Heads, it's always just I've got a file like that thick of designs that we either have in the design queue or that we've done or that I'm working on, and it's just a fun offshoot of the brand. It's fun for me because a lot of people that buy the merch, they may not even smoke cigars, but they aspire to the ethos of the company. So it's been a
exactly.
fun extension of Crown Heads for me. In fact, there's a guy up in Oregon who is a great supporter. And he sent me a DM not too long ago and said, "I just ordered the new hat." And he goes, "This makes 100 that I have from you guys." And I'm like, we designed 100 hats. I was like, holy crap. Yeah, it's fun, man. So like I try to time it's like every 4 to 6 weeks we have a new drop. And we do a limited run, like maybe 144 pieces per design. And then we just do something different.
Do you ship to Canada?
We do now. We do now.
Where can our viewers go on to buy the hats if they so choose?
crownheads.com, click on
Right on.
store, and it's all through Shopify. And so, yeah,
Beautiful.
initially we weren't able to, but I guess now Shopify has kind of stepped up their game. So we're able to ship to Europe, Canada, all that stuff.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I know we went through a lot the past almost half hour, and time's been flying by. Just so much to talk about with you. It's such a genuine cigar enthusiast. So just to give
My
our viewers a
pleasure.
recap, you're La Carême, a different size, from a Cuban tradition style. Is that what you're referring to when you say like that?
Pastelitos is just, it's like an old Cuban dessert of sorts. And so it just kind of keeps in vein with Carême being like dessert oriented. So it's just called pastelitos, but it's going to be a short little format smoke for the winter months. I'm working on right now. It's like a 5x54 with a pigtail, round, not box pressed like Carême. And we'll do a limited run of those for hopefully February, March.
Yep, and then we also hope to get in La Pâtissier
Yes,
sooner than later in the Canadian market. It's just something that I think a lot of the people here would love to try.
it's great
For
stuff.
just the Connecticut broadleaf wrapper in general, such a hearty,
Mm-hmm.
subtle, sweet tobacco wrapper a lot of people love. But I know it's not the most accessible wrapper; it's very sought after.
Yes,
So it's great you have that level of access to be able to produce such sophisticated blends, and continue to be the innovative the way you have always been with all your blends.
thank you.
And so, just to, also I want to touch back on the sampler pack
Mm-hmm.
actually. So, like in terms of strength levels, do you think that it's a good balance? They bounce off each other, La Imperiosa, La Carême, and Mil Diaz.
Very
There's
much
also
so.
the Juan Brown,
Jack
Jack
Brown. Yeah.
Brown, OBS. Yeah,
Jack Brown is a size in Jericho Hill, and it's
yeah,
also in Juarez too. A little confusing, but at any rate, yeah, I think that's a great balance. I mean, Mil Diaz to me of that entire range that you just told me is probably the most accessible smoke, not too heavy. Imperios is probably at the top end of the scale in terms of heavy, spicy, hearty.
right on.
But I think that gives a really good range over those four SKUs that you just described.
Appreciate that, John.
Good
Yeah,
work.
so we also want to be respectful of your time. I think that just brings us to the limit here. And if there's
We
any
can do
other
it again.
questions, of course, we would more than be happy to do it again for sure.
Thank
Very
you. I
appreciative of
appreciate
that.
it. Thank you,
And
man.
if anybody else has any questions after this is released, I'll just send you an email or DM, if that's okay
Absolutely.
with you. Yeah,
Happy to do it. Happy
yeah,
to do it. I'd love to
that's
jump on here again. I appreciate you taking the time because I get asked to do these interviews a lot, but if it's not during a certain set of business hours, it's hard for me. So it was nice to have this one in the middle of the day. So
yeah.
thank you.
We're always more than happy to work around your busy schedule. No problem at all.
Thank you.
Thanks again,
Thank you. It's
John.
been a pleasure,
Appreciate
Joseph.
it.
Thank you,
Alrighty,
man.
we'll talk soon.
All right. Cheers.
Take care. Bye.
Yep.